Today we have a dramatic game between Alireza Firouzja and Shakhriyar Mamedyarov played in the Super United Rapid and Blitz. This game was played with 25 minutes for each side with a 10-second increment. Alireza has the white pieces, Mamedyarov has black. Let's jump right in. White plays c4, e5 is the response, g3, bishop e7. A strange move at first, but I'll clarify this in a bit. Bishop g2, f5, b3, knight to f6, bishop to b2, and d6. Now, this move order is strange, but essentially what Shakhriyar Mamedyarov has done is simply played a classical Dutch in reverse. So let's assume that c4 was played and he had just played f5, a more normal move in a Dutch than, say, just a normal move order, bishop e7, the exact same formation as you get in the game. e3, castles, knight to e2, c6. So we see this structure. Black controls a lot of central squares with this c6, d6, e5, f5 pawn structure, and he helps control d5. The only downside of this pawn structure, it's a little unstable. So white can sort of pick at it a little bit and try to put pressure on it, but it does control a lot of space. Castles, bishop to e6, knight to c3, knight b to d7, d3. So now the minor pieces are all developed and the middle game begins. Again, black controls a lot of space, somewhat fragile structure. White's going to try to attack c6. He's already got this bishop aiming right at it. So the idea is to play b3, b4, and try to create a weakness on this square. That's white's main agenda. Black will want to expand either in the center or on the king side and attack. Queen to e8, shifting the queen to the king side for pressure. Queen to d2, another option was just d4. At this point, he could expand in the center, but Firouzja plays queen to d2. The king moves to h8. An okay move. I guess the idea basically is to tuck this bishop back on g8. It seems a little passive to me, but it's perfectly fine. b4, beginning the plan of pressuring this c6 pawn. Bishop g8, b5. Rook to c8 to defend the pawn, so Firouzja can't just take and then capture the pawn with his bishop. And then rook a to b1. A move that may seem strange at first, as this b-file seems blocked, but after capturing on c6, the b-file will be opened. He could play bishop a1, rook to b7 is the idea. d5 expanding in the center. Pawn takes on c6, and then pawn takes on d5. Again, black has nice central space, but white has many ways to attack this center. f4 is a possibility, d4 is a possibility, and black has to play accurately. The computer's like bishop to a1 here, just continuing the idea of rook going to b7. But Firouzja plays f4. He wants to compromise these dark squares in the center and put pressure on black. E4 was Mamedyarov's response. Makes a lot of sense. The computers recommend this silly line, d4, and after pawn takes, playing e4. Really bizarre. And after capturing a couple of times on e4, white is up 2 pawns, and the computer gives black a winning advantage in this position. Just he's totally winning, like 2.5 pawn advantage. I can only assume it's the vulnerability of white's king and all of these weak light squares and pawns and so forth that are just worth more than the material here. But human beings really don't play that way. E4 was played in the game. Knight jumps into d4, taking advantage of these newly weakened dark squares. Queen to h5, putting some pressure on the king side. Knight to a4. That helps clear this long diagonal for this bishop. It also adds some control to the c5 square, so black can't just jump into c5 and attack d3. Knight to g4 with the simple threat of queen takes h2, check and mate. Super GMs don't fall for that, so h3 kicks the knight back. And the problem for black, it's very hard for him to get pressure on white's king. You know, how does he get these other pieces active and involved in the attack? It's really almost impossible. Rook b to c1, challenging the rook. The queen moves to g6, threatening the g3 pawn. King to h2 to defend it. Pawn takes d3. Now, the idea here basically is to clear this e4 square so the knight at f6 can pop in and take advantage of the newly weakened square. Queen takes d3. The knight goes to e4, so now the knight along with the queen are threatening the g3 pawn, and white really just has to take that knight. So bishop takes knight. And he can take either way with the d pawn was fine, but he chose to take with the f pawn. And that does leave a weakness on d5 and also create a bit of a pawn majority for white in on the king side. Queen to b5 hits the knight at d7. Rook takes c1, rook takes c1. And now really a nice, cute little move from Mamedyarov. Knight to e5. The knight cannot be taken because if you take the knight, then just rook to f2 check leads to a very quick mate. After king h1, queen g3, there's simply nothing to be done to stop mate. So the knight cannot be taken. So Firouzja plays the queen back to e2 to help control this f3 square, and where the knight might pop in. The knight chooses to go to the c4 square, attacking this bishop. Now the bishop is defended, but it's very important to notice that this bishop on b2 on this long diagonal is a beast. I mean, it is easily the best minor piece that white has in this position. It is the heart and soul of his position. Black would love to get it off the board. Firouzja is not going to let that happen. Tucks it away at a1. The queen goes to a6, attacks the knight at a4. The knight comes back to c3, and now bishop to f6. He has to do something to challenge this bishop at a1. That bishop on that long diagonal is everything. So Firouzja plays this brilliant idea, knight to d1. And the idea is he wants to play the knight to f2 and g4 to get this bishop out of the way. It's all about that bishop. Rook to b8, knight to f2, continuing that process. Queen to a3. Mamedyarov attacks the e3 pawn twice, so it has to be defended. Rook to e1. Now rook to b6 with a threat of rook a6, followed by queen takes a2. The threats continue, but now knight to g4. Firouzja attacks this bishop directly. He wants that bishop out of the way. The bishop moves to e7, and now knight to f5, attacking the bishop and also threatening actually bishop g7 mate for the moment. So bishop to f8 is essentially forced. Now bishop to d4 plants the bishop on a really strong central square, defended by the pawn at e3. It's a very powerful minor piece, and hits the rook at b6, which now moves to a6, attacking that a2 pawn. Now rook to b1. Here, black's best bet is you can play bishop to e6, hitting the knight at f5. Also, queen takes a2, exchanging. These are also balanced positions. Black is up a pawn, but white has very strong pieces. It's a playable game. But the move Mamedyarov plays is a really bad blunder. It's a losing move. He plays queen to d3, double question mark, unfortunately, because after queen takes d3, ed3, rook to b8, and the pressure on this bishop at f8 is enormous, and he just can't lose it because g7 is too sensitive. Rook takes a2 check. If he plays, say, bishop to a3 to protect the bishop, well, bishop g7 checkmate. And the rook can't defend the bishop because the knight would just take the rook. So he plays rook a2 check, king to h1. The knight comes into d6, trying to put some pressure on this knight at f5. Knight takes g7. And watch this. Well, why can't black just take that knight? Watch this response that Firouzja would have played. Knight to h6. Wow. Threatening rook takes g8 mate, because the knight would defend the rook. The bishop cannot take the knight because it is pinned. And if he can't just take the bishop, that's checkmate. So that would have been a really spectacular move. Mamedyarov sees this, so he plays knight to b5, again, trying to do anything to deal with this bishop. The bishop moves to f6, continuing that same threat. So in order to alleviate that threat, Mamedyarov plays h5. Once Mamedyarov got in trouble, he defended with great intensity. I gotta hand it to him. h5, knight to f5, discovered check. The king moves to h7. Now it has access to that square because he played h5. Rook to b7 check, bishop to f7. If he plays king to g6, do you see the response? That's right, knight to h4, checkmate would be the move in that case. Bishop to f7, rook takes bishop, king to g6, rook f8, king takes knight. So white has a decisive material advantage. However, as all this has been going on, this pawn has just been sitting at d3, only 2 squares away from queening. So how does white stop that pawn from queening? It turns out it would have required really a computer-like idea of e4 check. And if pawn takes, knight to e3 check, The knight helps control the queening square after, say, king e6, g4, rook e2, trying to get rid of the knight. You can push the king around, and after king to d7, rook to d8, king c6, knight to c4, and the rook and the knight help control the pawn's advance and would win the game. If instead the king takes, then you just kick the king around for a while before his pieces end up in the exact correct spot. Here, just threatening the pawn, and if he plays d2, that would be mate. So that would be why e4 worked. But what Firouzja played, a more human idea, is knight to h2, d2, and now bishop to c3, a discovered check. So Mamedyarov gets the piece back because the bishop has to take the pawn, rook takes d2. So after all of that fighting and complications, Mamedyarov has actually equalized the position. A very impressive defensive performance, but how tired is he after expending all of that energy? Rook to e8, king to d3, knight f3, rook to d1 check, king g2, knight to d6, hits the rook, rook to d8 hits the knight, knight goes to c4, rook to d5 check, king to e4, and this is black's idea. After rook takes rook, which was played in the game, knight takes e3 check, king to f2, knight d1 check, king to e1. So we have basically an even knight and pawn endgame. Black is able to hold with best play. That is the key idea. Knight to e3, knight to d2 check, king to d3, knight to b3, and here Mamedyarov plays a strong idea. h4, excuse me. He wants to break up those pawns on the king side. Pawn takes pawn, knight to g2 check, king to f2, and knight to h4, king to g3, knight to f5 check, and king to g4, hitting the knight on f5. Now, both sides have less than 2 minutes on the clock. And here Mamedyarov, after defending brilliantly for many, many moves when he got in huge trouble, makes a mistake. The drawing idea for black here is this. Knight to h6 check, king g5, knight f7 check, king g6, and then king to e4. So when black takes the knight, then just king takes f4, and white does not have time to stop black from munching this last pawn, and white would have insufficient material to deliver checkmate. King and knight on their own can't do it. That was the drawing concept. But Mamedyarov plays knight to d4. And after knight takes knight, king takes knight, realizes that he is in a lost king and pawn endgame. f5, king e5, king g5, and a5. And the a pawn just isn't fast enough. It just can't move quickly enough. f6, king e6, king g6, a4, f7. Realizing the pawn will queen well before his own, Mamedyarov resigned in a drama-filled rapid game against two amazing players. A brilliant attack, a brilliant defense, fatigue in the end. Wow, exciting chess. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.